Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for coming to this panel at the end of a day of presentations at the New Zealand Food Safety and Research Centre here in Dunedin. What?
Annual seminar.
Annual seminar. I'm being prompted by the expert on my right. I'm Kim Hill, and I've been taking notes all day. And looking at the exhibitors, we have microbial detection, we have allergen tests, hygiene tests, antibiotic, pesticide tests, forensic origin tests. We have the promise of increasing shelf life by means of antioxidants and oleoresins, and flavour enhancement, superior quality, more longevity, we are promised. Now, no shade cast on the sponsors, heaven forfend. But as journalist Michael Pollan might say, is it food? Now, he said you should not eat anything that your grandmother wouldn't recognise. Oh. Well, welcome to 2023, Granny. But is it safe? Libby Harrison, who's Director of Food Safety Science and Research Centre, laid out exactly why trust in New Zealand food supply is crucial, and you're all relying on science to make it so. Against that is the conviction on the part of many that natural, organic, local and seasonal is the only way to ensure safe and nutritious food. Plus, there is what Michael Pollan called nutritionism, the idea that food is just a collection of nutrients that we can mix and match. Added this and added that, exaggerate this and that, margarine. Replaced animal fat with laboratory-altered vegetable fat, supposed to be one of the great health breakthroughs. That was not safe, but it was certainly the product of science. All these things and more I will put to the panel. Let me introduce them now. Sirma Karapeeva is the CEO of the Meat Industry Association. Glen Neal is from the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. Dr. Phil Bremer, he's a professor actually, Phil Bremer is of the University of Otago, President of the New Zealand Institute of Food Science and Technology. Dr. Jocelyn Eason from Plant and Food Research, and Dr. Peter Cressey of the ESR. Let me invite them each in turn to give a brief presentation of their core values.
Shall I start?
You go.
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about my core values because I don't know whether anybody really cares about my core values, but I will talk a little bit about the burning question that has been posed to us: does food safety actually make our food safer or not, or why do we care about it? So, as Kim said, I'm the Chief Executive of the Meat Industry Association, and one of our key roles is to support all our members to export food, to export red meat right around the world to over 110 countries, feeding millions of consumers worldwide. And so for us, it's paramount that the food that we produce and we export is safe. We know that in New Zealand we have a really strong regulatory framework, food safety regulatory framework, and over the years that has stood us in really good stead to give consumers right around the world the confidence that the food that we produce is safe, and it is quality, and it is what it says it actually is. So that, to a large extent, is based on the science that sits behind the parameters that we work towards when we process and package and export our food. So for us, science, when done right, is absolutely paramount for safe food, and we really do stand behind the scientific society in New Zealand that helps us to continue this excellent journey on producing food that is safe and of high quality.
Thank you, Sirma. Glen?
Thanks, Kim. Kia ora te Poti. I'm Glen Neal from FSANZ, Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. So I'm from the government. I'm here to help. So when you talk about values, one that's really important to me is transparency. And transparency, I learned recently, is actually different to openness. Openness can be about just putting everything on your website and doing business that way and thinking that you're being transparent, whereas transparency is all about really understanding the richness of various perspectives and ensuring that you're communicating with your audiences on their terms in ways that matter to them. And that's a big ask, because there's lots of audiences, and increasingly individual or organisational values are at play, and increasingly those values, whilst being very individual, can be quite specific and sometimes in conflict with each other. But as individuals, we all love our own values. We all think that they're the best, of course, and we won't hear of people with different values or who might see things from a different perspective. So transparency is really important to me and for FSANZ.
Thank you. I have no idea what that means.
Were you not listening?
Well, you know, I mean transparency.
I just explained it.
I don't mean to pick on you.
Well, you've started.
I know. I could have started with Sirma and pointed out that the World Health Organization rates red meat on the same level as glyphosate when it comes to carcinogens.
Well, and I
anyway.
will rebut you on that one, because we've got science to prove that
Well,
is not true.
Well, of course
Science.
you have. No, of course you have.
Yeah, and when you say the WHO...
Don't start, Andy. Just don't start, because I want to go to Phil.
Right, thank you. I'll go a little bit less controversial and say that if we restricted ourselves to doing and eating what our grandparents ate or did, life would be pretty boring. So there's so many foods and exciting foods that weren't available when you're growing up in Invercargill, 50 years ago, that we now enjoy. And I think of things such as, obviously when my grandma cooked cabbage, she bought it, thought it was grey, and And now we have...
That was to kill the listeria.
Well, I don't think it was. Yeah. I don't think she was too worried about
knew what they
listeria.
were doing.
Maybe they did. Okay, the food was safe, but it wasn't exactly that palatable. And obviously, today we want things other than just a stodgy mess. We want food that tastes good. We want it that's natural. We want it to be enjoyable. We want it to be convenient. And in order to get all those things, we need to use science rather than just boil it for 30 minutes.
Yes, natural. We'll hold that thought. Because I don't think we need science to keep it natural, do we?
Well, how many grandparents do you go back? I mean, once upon a time we were sitting there eating berries and raw meat, and then someone thought about cooking it, and everyone else said, that's a good idea, it tastes a lot better and it's more palatable.
You're being silly now. Jocelyn. Jocelyn Eason, ladies and gentlemen, Plant and Food Research.
Kia ora, everybody. Well, I think science has actually made our food safe. I think science is probably going to make some new foods less safe than some of the traditional ones, but then it can also help us work out what the risks associated with those foods are. So plant and food, we know that science delivers safe vegetables and fruits. We know how to grow them. We know how to grow them in a way that the residues are relatively low. I think there's been a study in the States that said New Zealand apples have got the lowest residues worldwide. I don't know, maybe the States apples are slightly higher than the rest of the world, but be it as it may, that's the data. I think we need to be personally responsible for our food as well. And that's probably quite a challenge. If I was only eating what my grandmother was eating, probably wouldn't be having broccoli, that's for sure. We didn't get it down south back in the days. We wouldn't be having gold and red kiwi fruit now. But we really do understand, and this is something that science provides us, is what the risk with foodborne pathogens is all about. And we understand the allergens a little bit more often, rather than just getting sick regularly every time you eat a peanut or something. Actually, we know about peanut allergies, and we're starting to understand some of the other things that just keep us healthy, what nutrition is, what anti-nutritionals are. So I think science has a big place to play in food safety, and I think personal responsibility and making sure you know what those use-by dates really mean and keeping your fridge clean is another thing that we should be thinking about for food safety.
Thank you. And we were talking today about how we should maybe ditch the best-by dates and just focus on the use-by dates. That's a whole other issue. We'll talk about that maybe. Peter?
Yeah, so I'm glad that Jocelyn kept using the word risk in there, because that's my home place. And my passion in food safety is about good decision making. And good decision making is based on an understanding of the risk. So that's where I come in. I weigh evidence, I look at evidence, and then I provide people like Glen, people like Roger and Tanya, with the information to make good decisions about food safety.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it, I'm sorry. I gave them best shot and that's all I could come up with.
You're catching up.
That wasn't what I expected. All right, let's talk about dietary safety just for a moment, because I don't want to bang on about it, but I did raise the issue about how the World Health Authority classes red meat in the same carcinogenic category as glyphosate. Please explain.
So, look, I'm sitting on a panel with esteemed scientists who probably know the science inside out way better than I do. But what I do know is that the World Health Organization and many of the Eat Lancet studies are based on the consumption of red meat at excessive levels. We've just finished a research study with Ag Research, Auckland University, Massey University, and a whole bunch of other esteemed scientific organisations here in New Zealand that looks at the impact of red meat on a healthy human when fed at the recommended daily dosage, which is in line with our food, the Ministry of Health guidelines for healthy eating. And when you look at it through that lens, the impact of eating red meat actually has beneficial impacts on your well-being and on your nutritional values as compared to if you eat in excess. If you eat anything in excess, it's not good.
It does occur to me that it's a very individual thing, right? One person's perfectly adequate diet of red meat might be another person's poison. And this is what I wanted to hear during the day from somebody, but nobody brought it up. It's such an individual thing. It's to do with your genetic makeup, it's to do with epigenetics, as to what is safe and what isn't. I mean, if we talk about listeria, for example, you know, one person might get sick from listeria, somebody else will be absolutely fine. So where do you set the bar? Peter?
Yeah, I'd just like to come back to what Jocelyn was talking about.
Oh, fine, ignore the question.
You don't dump me in it, eh?
Sorry, not Jocelyn.
15 seconds
Sirma.
of an introduction, and then you ignore the question.
I
No,
know.
that's fine.
Yeah, but I think the point about meat is that they often focus in the studies on the amount of meat people eat. What they don't tend to look at so much is what they're not eating. So what is the diet likely to be of a person who's eating large amounts of meat, possibly low in vegetables and fruit? And we know from countless studies the beneficial aspects of fruit and vegetables. So I think, you know, any of these factoids needs to be dug into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry, what was your question again?
I can have a crack
Like
at
you care.
I'll have a crack at answering it.
Go on then.
So,
Got somebody who's picked up on my favourite question. I can't remember what it was now. What was it?
listeria.
I think
So most of us eat listeria probably on a daily basis. Some of us, I think there's some studies that we at least 1 million listeria per meal at least once a year, several thousand quite often. But the food regulations are designed to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable people in the community. So for listeria, it's the very old, the pregnant woman, the elderly, and people on immune suppression drugs. So they're designed to support the weakest.
Yes, which is a fairly low bar, isn't it? No, I mean it is.
There's quite a motive issue has been, a pregnant lady has abortion. A lot of our cases of listeria, we have about 26 cases of listeria deaths a year, 26 deaths associated with listeria a year.
But how do you assess the listeria? How do you assess? Do you wait until somebody says, "I'm sick and I ate that piece of cheese"?
There's two ways. One, there's products that are considered to be at risk. They're tested.
Right.
So there's routine testing of at-risk products and surveillance testing, and then there's the trace-back testing. It's really hard to actually trace back listeria because it can take up to 50, 60 days before you show the symptoms. So.
Yeah, and as somebody pointed out, by that time the product's gone.
Pretty much.
Whatever it was that gave you the listeria.
Yep.
There was a very interesting talk from a representative of King Salmon about the great efforts they went to solve their listeria issue. Now, we also heard, not from King Salman, but from other people, about various technical fixes being explored to get rid of E. coli or Salmonella or listeria in food. You know, plasma-activated water, God knows what. Is there a risk that we will get so techy that food producers and processors will just leave it to the technical fix as opposed to cleaning up their own processes? What do you think? Anybody?
No, the technologies that effectively clean up products at the end of a process are pretty expensive, and they tend to be a little bit hit and miss as well. So no, the basic principle of food production and processing is that you take reasonable steps along the chain to minimise contamination. That ends up lowering the risk, but it also lowers the cost of production as well.
All right, you agree with that?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking back to an innovation that took place in our industry, and this is for the export of chilled product right across the world, and the shelf life that goes with that chilled product. I mean, it really does start with taking steps right at the beginning on farm to manage the health of the animal and how that animal is handled and treated, right through to actually packaging the product in the factory. So if we leave it all to technology, I think that personal responsibility for managing the risk throughout the supply chain is removed, and you'll never have a good outcome at the end. So, you know, one of the great things that we've managed to do is that even without sort of additives or whatever, we can achieve up to 90 days of shelf life for chilled products. So a consumer in the UK, not currently because obviously they're experiencing high inflation, but previously they would sit down and eat a leg of lamb that's chilled, which is just as good as fresh from New Zealand. And they will enjoy it, and they'll come back for more because it's matured, it's safe, it's healthy, it's natural. And that is because, you know, processors have taken the responsibility to manage the risk right throughout the chain, and they've taken their personal responsibility, not just relying on a, IA bottle or whatever. Because ultimately it comes down to your reputation as a food producer and an exporter.
I mean, that's in an ideal world, but
well,
you get rogue elements and people who don't care about reputation.
Well, I mean,
the
they probably will get
is
taken out of the business altogether, wouldn't they?
the ideal is,
Yeah.
from the farm to the fork, the whole,
Yeah.
business. And there are ways of tracing that increasingly.
Correct. Yeah.
So does that add an extra layer to the insurance of safety, do you think?
I mean, absolutely, traceability is paramount, so that
Right.
if there is an incident or something, and it is required by legislation, that we can trace back any consignment to origin. And that is to safeguard exactly what you're talking about. In case there is some sort of incident, we can go back, look at what the situation is, put in a fix, and make sure it doesn't happen again.
And get the affected product out of the supply chain too.
And take the product out of the supply chain.
Maintaining
Exactly.
that consumer trust in your products and processes.
I want to talk about climate change for a moment. I mean, we could talk all day about climate change. But you can see I've been going through the day sort of jotting things down like a demented magpie. But one of the things that somebody said was that if you grow more crops inside, vertically and or inside, they can use more agri-chemicals because there's no fear of the rain causing runoff. What do you say about that?
I would say agri-chemicals are extremely expensive liquids, and who wants to spray them on and be wasteful? I would have thought that in enclosed environments, unless you get an outbreak of pests and diseases, you wouldn't use them at all. You've got a lot more control. You can minimise those pests and diseases to come in on your crops. You can use really good hygiene to minimise the diseases.
But
and you
doesn't
wouldn't spray
growing
it on.
inside increase the chances of disease?
No. I would. One thing we've been thinking about this in plant and food because plants need to be, if it's plants, they need to be a little bit stressed. You can use lights to stress them to put them in a situation so that they could be protected. But you also have to introduce those pests and diseases. They don't just hang about all over the place all the time. So
Well,
make your...
fungi do, don't they? They're all
Yeah,
over
but
the
you
shop.
sterilise all your... Well, you don't have soils in some of these. You just use hydroponics or aeroponics. So you've only got water. Make sure you've got really clean water. Those use a lot of hygiene. You know, as long as the people aren't bringing things in, you might need your people to be wearing lovely big white outfits with, you know, covers on their feet and hair nets and everything, and treat it quite hygienically. You won't get introduction of pests and diseases. Your residue should be quite low, if there should be none.
I think to put that comment into context, this was a guy from the Hawke's Bay, and they were saying that they can't actually apply the pesticides and insecticides at the moment because they keep getting washed off.
Too much rain.
So I don't think they want to use more. They just want to be able to use them in the responsible way in an area where they'll be effective and not just, you know, rained upon.
Still, I mean, if you're growing something inside and you don't have to worry about it being washed away, then it's going to stay on the crops longer. Is that not a hazard in any way? Or are we all completely relaxed about agrochemicals now?
So agrochemicals have residues, and you can wash those residues off the produce before it goes to market.
Right.
But they also break down as well. So it depends on the agrochemical, how long the wait would be before consumers eat it, what the processing and washing would be, but they would be cleaned before they go to consumers.
Because, I mean, would you see the whole move that I referred to earlier of organic, natural, seasonal, local, unpasteurised? Would you see, if I can you know what I'm talking about, would you see that as anti-science?
Yeah, absolutely, and anti-productivity as well.
Was it the anti-pasteurised that set you off on that? If I hadn't mentioned that, would it have been all right?
No, not really. No. Listen, we're watching something unfold in Europe which I think is potentially quite disastrous. It's called the New Green Deal. And there's probably people about to throw things at me, but the New Green Deal has the potential to drive Europe's production back by 50 years, which means they're going to exert an import pressure on the planet's food supply. They're going to start importing products that would otherwise be considered local in places like Africa and the Middle East, etc. And I just think that the ideologies that sit behind the New Green Deal.
Well, can you be more specific? What's the problem?
Well, the problem is the shift to organic production, for example, it drives down yields, right? You don't get the yields, you don't get the crop per volume relative to conventionally farmed product. We saw this in Sri Lanka, right?
Well, we did see that in Sri Lanka. We don't know, you know, there are certain variables involved in a country like Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. And, 500 million people suddenly switching to organics or shifting to organics with quite an aggressive target, I think presents some disastrous scenarios for the planet.
Yeah, well, we know that the Europeans are not self-sufficient in food across the board. Certainly in meat and dairy, they're not self-sufficient. So if they move to a system whereby their production and productivity levels are further constrained, they will have to source globally, which means that there's going to be less product available for countries that really do need it. And so the whole food security, food sufficiency argument globally becomes much more relevant and potentially more difficult to resolve.
Peter, do you think that there's any truth in the perception that the food we eat has got riskier in some ways?
No, I don't believe so. I believe it has
Or
become...
we've got more vulnerable?
Have we become more vulnerable? No, I don't think so. We've become more aware. You know, I think if you went back 30 years, somebody would get food poisoning. They go, I probably did it to myself, and you'd never hear about it. Whereas now they'll broadcast it on social media, and the purported source of that food poisoning will be published halfway around the world. So I think the world's become smaller. We've become more aware of these things and we broadcast them more.
Do you think that there's any truth in the suggestion that just as one theory was that our homes were too clean and that's why we all became allergic to things.
Right, the hygiene hypothesis.
Is there any truth in the suggestion that because we've become hyper-conscious of sterilising our food, we've become more vulnerable to, you know, a wee bit of salmonella poisoning?
Don't get me started. I mean, we're talking about grandmother and her food supply, right? So 50 years ago, we all used to buy local, put our meat in a meat safe and live to the ripe old age of 45.
Well,
So now you're saying,
we didn't. No, that's nonsense. Don't try that one. Because people live to a ripe old age.
they do now.
They did then.
They do now.
Well, we're living longer than we ever have before, right?
Well, fewer children are dying.
Fewer children are dying. So the life expectancy in New Zealand has never been this long, right? We're looking at a future, though, where it's going to start to decrease because of obesity, if you want to get back to nutrition, but that's a different story. But the food supply has played a significant part, along with vaccinations and chlorinated water and all of those good things. It's played a significant part in advancing the life expectancy of not just New Zealand, but Western and developed countries around the planet.
So if science really wanted to make food safe, it would tell everybody to take the sugar out and the salt out, wouldn't it? If you're talking about dietary problems.
Oh, salt and sugar are good preservatives.
Yeah.
They serve a functional purpose in a food. You've got to actually have sugar to actually make your body function. You've actually got to have a certain amount in your diet. We forget about that, don't we?
So from whence
Has everybody forgotten about that?
From whence cometh obesity then?
Well, from the overconsumption of nutrients relative to our energy expenditure.
Quite right. So what's science got to say about that? Do you have any control over that at all? Or are you just on the sidelines lecturing people about listeria?
Well, also lecturing them about good diets, but besides that, no, I think it's an extremely difficult problem to tackle.
Yeah.
Because it's personal behaviours. And, you know, I kind of have a personal theory is that we're almost as an organism programmed to eat when the food's there. If you go back, thousands of years, food was a lot scarcer, so it was important to eat when the food was available. Now, I think that continues, but we've developed to a stage where food is always available.
We used to have to go out and chase our food. We used to have to go and catch it.
Yeah.
Now, look at us. Sitting in front of a television, you can dial up somebody to bring it to your door, which might be about 10 steps away. You sit back down, you eat it, and you think of other ways to not have to move.
Yeah, up until recently, we wouldn't have considered, obesity to be a food safety issue, even though when we survey consumers, they'll say that overeating is one of the greatest food safety issues. But more and more, as scientists, we're understanding the importance of communicating with consumers, trying to inform them of good strategies around food. So I think we're all sort of moving.
Can't be fat shaming though.
No, but we
That's a tricky dilemma, isn't it?
We teach them how to read labels. We teach them how to understand what's in their food, and that's both for food safety but also educational purpose. So we as scientists we're evolving too as the market need evolves.
Tell me about labelling. Is it adequate in New Zealand? Does it tell people everything that they need to know in terms of safety of food?
Well, for a start, most people don't read the labels.
Well, you just said that they ought to.
They ought to,
So,
yes, they do.
Let's pretend that they do. What will they find?
A lot of people don't understand the label.
Oh, well, that's going to be a really useful exercise.
Yeah, there is work being undertaken.
Also, very small print.
It is small print. However,
They're not meant to be read, right?
Food Standards Code requires it to be legible, Kim.
Does it?
Yes.
Well, to who?
so fortunately, there is quite a lot of work being undertaken to understand how consumers read labels and how to improve them.
What should be on that label that isn't on the label?
A QR code which takes you off to somewhere where you can read it properly and see everything else that you want to see.
But what should be available for the consumer on food labels or the QR code or information that they're not getting now?
Star rating?
In terms of whether
Well,
it's...
an interpretive, see at a glance view of the nutritional quality of that food product.
Right.
And that's where we're moving towards. We're in a voluntary phase with that at the moment. the ministers in agreeing that be voluntary 2 or 3 years ago set some 5-year targets, and there's no possible way those targets are going to get met in a couple of years' time on the current track. So ministers are then going to have to consider whether or not that be mandatory for Australia and New Zealand, and it's quite likely that it will be. So hopefully that will be something that consumers can pick up and really run with in terms of both the conscious and subconscious decision-making processes when it comes to food.
I mean, I think, labelling certainly has a role to play in all of this, but it has to be meaningful labelling. So the star rating, the nutritional panel on your food, that actually conveys some real information is worthy, and it should continue. There's a whole bunch of other labelling that's currently applied to products all around the world that is just responding to fads. This is my personal opinion. Country of origin labelling. What does it actually tell you about the safety of a product? Particularly when it's made, it says made from local and imported ingredients. Imported from what? What is the percentage?
Well, that's what we'd like to know, where it's imported from.
No, but you'll never get that on the label because of exactly the issue that you said. The label's already so tiny that by the time you list the 500...
make it bigger, because a lot of people do want to know about country of origin.
Yeah, the only people who want to know about country of origin labelling are racists.
Yeah, I mean, does it really matter? Does it really matter? I
have to suggest to you that can't be true.
Well, no, it is.
Well, yes, it is.
Xenophobes.
Is it
Xenophobic, racist,
Sure.
If the product has been produced to a safe standard and has been ticked off by the regulator as a safe product...
That's the headline, isn't it?
What does it really matter?
The only people who want country of origin labelling are racists.
Xenophobes is the finer word for it.
Protectionists?
We could edit that for radio.
No, I'd go for it.
How about consumers in overseas markets who think of New Zealand as a safe product?
I don't think you need to be either a xenophobe... Sorry to interrupt. I don't think about it.
What sort of market
and
for?
I'll come back with. I don't think you need to be a racist or a xenophobe to have perhaps a political opinion, a legitimate political opinion on not wanting to eat grapes from Israel or...
But if you go to Israel, will you eat grapes there?
What?
If you do go to Israel, sitting by a pool in a, lovely resort, and they serve you grapes, will you eat those grapes?
Yeah, because
they're made in...
I'm not going to
so what difference does it make?
I'm not going to sit in Israel and demand imported food.
Sirma.
No, but...
That's silly.
No, but what difference does it make?
It matters because we are spending our valuable dollars on bringing food in from a country that I don't want to...
Why not? It meets our standards. It's made it through the border.
All right. But I don't think you necessarily need to be a racist or a xenophobe. I think people are entitled, surely, to cheer. You're looking at me completely askance, Jocelyn. Like you've never struck anybody with this opinion before. You must have.
No.
People have a right to decide where their food comes from. It's part of the full spectrum of knowledge about what they eat, isn't it? No, you all disagree.
No, I think country of origin...
don't disagree. But whether it should be on labels or not, I think is a moot point. I mean, I think if you feel that strongly about something, then do some homework.
On a tin of peaches. I mean, you're at the supermarket, you're going to buy a tin of peaches. How much homework do you do? I mean...
That's right. It should say, peaches from Russia. But anyway, what?
What difference does it make if it's from Russia?
People have...
if the peach is safe, if it's been canned in a proper facility and it has made it through the New Zealand border, what difference does it make? It just means that it might be a little bit cheaper.
There's this global amoral environment we're living in today, where it doesn't matter where anything comes
food,
from.
Right,
It's just food.
Eating pineapples in the middle of winter, eating
that's a whole other
tropical fruit in the middle of winter. They're not grown locally.
That's a whole other thing.
But people want to eat them.
People want to, but should they be able to?
Wow, you're
Well,
talking
they
about
informed
personal
choice,
choice.
The other fascinating thing that came... Glen Neal said... This is the guy...
It must be true then.
This is the guy...
Thank you, Peter.
This is the guy that said if it's only xenophobes care about food labels of origin. Science says bisphenol A, or BPA, in plastics is not a health risk.
That's right.
So nobody needs to worry about BPA.
That's right. Yeah, at the
Are you sure?
Yes, at the levels found in food packaging and the amount that migrates into food, which is then consumed, the levels are irrelevant. Yet it's the most animated thing prior to sugar that consumers have been animated about in the last 10 years.
Now, I'm interested
It's
to know...
irrational.
All right. I'm interested to know how you think, would anybody else, how they think that BPA got to be such a public enemy number, maybe one?
That's it. It's a great question. So I think there's a level of it's a paradoxical issue in that there's a level of sophistication that goes along with a consumer's perception of risk, but also there's essentially a difference between how consumers perceive risk versus how scientists effectively calculate and manage it, right? And it's essentially, the difference is essentially this thing called outrage, and the difference between hazard and risk are quite different. Hazard is like IARC in its business on aspartame at the moment, right? IARC will just give you a yes/no answer. Will
You're
something
talking
cause
about the
cancer?
agency of the World Health Organization that has said that aspartame is possibly carcinogenic.
Yes, it's one of two that's reviewing aspartame this month. And the other one that's just meeting as we speak is probably going to arrive at a different conclusion because it assesses the risk of illness from what consumers are exposed to. I.e., it just doesn't give you a binary yes, no, this will cause cancer. It actually goes a step further and goes, well, this is what people are being exposed to, and we all know, because Paracelsus said it 500 years ago, that the dose makes the poison. So it's what consumers are exposed to that actually puts that hazard in a context which enables regulators like us to make decisions about whether or not substances should stay or remain approved.
It does strike me that people are much more concerned about chemicals, aspartame, bisphenol, than they are about salmonella or other sort of food-borne diseases that perhaps they ought to be. What do you think?
I think so. I think, well, we know there's a lot of allergens in different plants. You can measure them. You have to label, even though the label's got quite small text. But chemicals feel foreign. They're not. They're the compounds in the plant. And I think it's just the way it's portrayed. People are just worried, you know.
I don't think BPA is a natural product.
No, BPA
Or
is-
aspartame.
No, but if you talk about foods are made up of a whole lot of different chemicals. If people knew, if you had to list all of the things in foods from a chemical composition perspective, they'd be horrified. Yeah,
And
I mean...
trust me, the nastiest ones are completely natural.
Yep.
Far and away.
Yeah.
Caffeine, nicotine.
Aflatoxin.
The dialogue, though, the surrounding narrative of BPA is that essentially it sounds like a foreign contaminant, doesn't it? BPA. BPA is actually a plasticizer. It's an ingredient of plastic. It's needed to give plastic its plasticky properties. So what happens when you take it out?
I don't know. You tell me.
You got to put
plasticky
another
properties.
plasticizer in.
What? But aren't we getting rid of plastic completely?
Well, in order
For the
to
health of
But
the-
can we get rid of plastic completely?
For the health, I was going to ask you about plastic. How's your meat going to get on without plastic?
Yeah, well, you see, that's the thing, because we rely on a certain level of plastic packaging to preserve our meat and make sure that it can travel across the globe to its consumers in the best possible shape, form and condition.
See, there's got
And
to
so
be...
we've done some research, and yes, there is a role for recycled packaging and the cardboard boxes and the likes, but ultimately when the plastic hits the product, we have to be 100% sure that there's going to be no contaminants, and so we need virgin plastic. It's very difficult to introduce recycled materials which we're not sure where they've come from and what they're made up of, and put that against a food that we are telling the consumer it's safe to eat this food without us having the certainty that the food is safe. So
That's another theme that came up today, actually, the sustainability and safety and the need to trade off. I mean, fewer agrochemicals may make food less safe, so there must be a trade-off in terms of safety if people are going to demand fewer agrochemicals for no good reason, you're telling me, Jocelyn, because they just sort of wash off.
Well, you don't need it. If you don't need agrochemicals, why would you put them on your food?
That's beside the point.
Okay.
Sustainability, that was a red herring. And just off you went. Sustainability and safety, has there got to be a trade-off? You know, we're talking about the plastic. Some products need plastic. If you are forced not to have plastic, then what do you say? Well, you know, caveat emptor, is it?
Well, I think with everything you have to examine the unintended consequences that may come out of a decision. And so the panel earlier today that I called was talking about sustainability and safety. And I said, well, at some point you've got to make a decision, you know. If you go all into sustainability, then you expose yourself to a whole lot of food safety hazards. Is that good enough? Was that bad enough?
And then that's not sustainable.
And that's
because
not
you get
sustainable
the food waste.
because then you get food waste and you get sick people and all sorts of things. The same thing in climate change, and you touched on climate change a little bit earlier. Yes, we all know that we need to do something about emissions, but we also have to be careful with what we do doesn't have unintended consequences of, killing off the breadbasket of New Zealand, which is the agricultural sector. And suddenly what? We might be surely clean and green, but we will have no money to import any of the products that we all enjoy, including foreign food.
What do you think about the AI in the future of food? There was a very interesting presentation, and it was about, AI being able to assess whether food is fresh or rotting, and you wouldn't need, it would just, order a new supply if it needed to, and nobody will ever go shopping anymore. That's beside the point. Somebody said, well, won't that mean that AI will reduce our ability to use our human senses and become dangerously dependent on it? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But would we ever lose our senses, though? The thing that you love about food is how it smells and how it tastes and all the texture. So you're going to use all your senses when you're eating the food. The fact that an AI can tell you before you can sense that something's off with listeria or whatever, and before you eat it's probably a good thing, because you don't want to sense it and you're only going to get sick. So I think there's a balance. AI should be quite useful. It's just making sure that we keep feeding it with all the right data.
Oh, well, that is the trick.
I do think there's a risk, though, that we'll lose our understanding of what's good and bad, and we get situations now where mushrooms come packaged with a best before date, and consumers look at their packaged mushrooms and throw them out. Somehow they've lost the ability to actually open the pack and decide whether that mushroom's fit to eat or not. Yeah. So the more we use machines or symbols or signs to tell us what to think, and the further we get it removed away from our food, the greater chance that we'll waste it.
Yeah.
So, I think you should be out in the garden digging and growing the food and eating your wonky vegetables and your lettuce.
And that comes back to the whole best before and use by, doesn't it? Because the best before is a marketing tool, isn't it?
No,
it's an advisory.
It's a quality indicator.
No. It's a government requirement, so it's done with the best of intents. It's around either.
I always thought it was the grocery people forcing us to buy more by throwing the best before away.
This is a minimum regulatory. This is a minimum regulatory requirement in the
but
Australian New
who's
Zealand Food
behest?
Standards Code.
And who's behest?
Well, we don't.
I mean, who decided? Nobody in the basement of any of the governments would have said, I think that people will enjoy these crackers if before this particular. That's not
We're not gullible enough in government to go, industry's telling us it's a good idea, therefore we'll go and do it.
It doesn't work like that either.
If you went to a supermarket and there was 2 bottles of milk there, brand A and brand B, and they didn't have best before dates, and brand B was 30 days old and brand A was 2 days old, and you took them both home, you'd taste brand A and whatever it was, the 2-day-old one and think that's great, you'd taste the 30-day-old one and think that's terrible, you never buy the 30-day-old brand B again. So it's a way that the food industry can sort of say to consumers, this is when our product's at its peak, and as a consumer you can look at that, and if it's past its best before date, you can still eat it or drink it, but you may sort of give it some allowance for its flavour not being perfect.
All right, so we're keeping the best before dates, are we?
No, we can.
Yeah.
Well, we're.
There's no plans to review them at present.
Don't you think they ought to be?
Oh, I thought there is some plans to review them, isn't there?
No, Phil. No, there's not.
Okay.
I'd like to agree with you, Phil, but that would make me wrong as well.
I'm sure one of my colleagues said that they've put in some pressure on the government to review them then.
Oh, there might be pressure, but there's no plan to review.
And who would the pressure be coming from?
So there is some concern that because, in the front row there, the one giggling, because consumers don't understand best before dates, they look at them and they throw it out, whereas we'd like them to think...
My point. That's why we don't need them.
I'm not disagreeing with you. He's disagreeing with you.
Is that just on principle, Phil?
I thought you were. Because you said, oh, it's quite handy. People go to the fridge and they look at the milk and there's best before.
So you change your best before dates to a produced on date?
No, you just say use by.
No, because used
that's
by
a safety thing.
that indicates that
Used
products
by.
become unsafe.
Yeah, exactly.
What are we going to do with all the complaints
the
about
milk-
This is the
staleness?
point. You're a whole bunch of scientists. What do you care about anything beyond what makes it safe or not?
That's food. Food can lose its optimal eating qualities and still be perfectly
It's
safe.
nothing to do with you. You're a scientist. You shouldn't be here talking about optimal eating quality.
Well, we're in the food industry. The food's got to taste good.
You're nothing to do with the food industry. You're supposed to be keeping us safe.
We want to make safe food that tastes great.
No, I think you've lost your way. I think you've lost your way. We're talking about safety of food. We're not talking about marketing schemes or...
Oh, they're interconnected.
Yeah. No, look, I think you're absolutely right. From a safety point of view...
Me?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Peter.
From a safety point of view, yeah, get rid of the best befores. But as a human being, as somebody who loves eating food, keep them. I want to know whether that food is at its best to be eaten now. I want to enjoy it as much as I can. So it's not a food safety issue, but it is an important issue, I think.
All right. What is it, let me ask you first, what is it in the next 10 years that you think is going to present the biggest challenge to science in terms of keeping food safe?
Yeah, I mean, the wider gamut of things called novel foods, and that's perhaps items that aren't traditionally consumed as foods, but somebody has a bright
This is
idea.
precision fermentation business.
Yeah,
that kind
you
of
better
thing.
ask Phil about that.
I will. All right.
So, but yeah, that's another aspect of novel foods.
What are you thinking about novel foods?
What am I thinking
What
about?
sort of novel foods are you thinking about?
I mean,
Ooh, too soon to say.
no, I mean, you get, say, fruits and that perhaps have been eaten in Africa and places like that, and somebody goes, might sell well in New Zealand.
Superfoods.
Maybe, yeah.
And what's your problem with that?
Because it doesn't have that history of safe consumption, we're taking a bit of a punt on it, and often to assess the safety of a novel food like that is not a simple exercise. It can be done through a vast array of toxicological testing, but often the innovators wanting to bring these foods in don't have that sort of financial backing, so they say, well, somebody ate it once and it was all right, so it should be all right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jocelyn?
Yeah, novel foods, I think cell foods. If cell foods are going to be cooked, you're probably fine.
Cell food.
Cell foods, something that you don't need to grow in an animal or on an animal. So made in culture from cells, make into a tissue. If those are not going to be cooked, and people go raw cell foods, sorry. Poor old Phil here, he's just shaking, he just doesn't like this at all. There's a challenge with how we can ensure that those are food safe. We just don't know. Yeah, so exciting areas.
And there's no reason why they wouldn't be subject to, other strange viruses and bacteria that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess the first step in the production of cultured meat is to is to sort of understand the cell line, and you go to a lot of effort to make sure you've got a nice clean cell line. You want it to be pathogen-free so it grows well. So there's companies that are specialising in finding nice cell lines. But there are a lot of challenges associated with their cultured meats in terms of what you grow it in, the growth hormones, the antibiotics, the scaffolding. You've got to give it some sort of shape and structure, so the scaffolding could be plant-based or it could be meat-based, and whether it becomes an allergen. One of the biggest challenges with these cultured meats is we don't exactly know how we're going to do it yet. So we don't even know all of the potential challenges.
Is that the same as the precision fermentation? What does that mean? I don't even know what that means.
I'm not exactly sure what...
Anybody know?
Yep.
I thought you would.
Thanks. Will you listen this time?
Yeah.
No?
I'm all ears.
Yeah, okay. So precision fermentation is basically about getting microbes to do the job of plants and that plants and animals have historically done in terms of producing particularly proteins in a bioreactor in a vat type scenario. So you're essentially harnessing bacteria, a bit of good old-fashioned genetic modification. You're teaching these bacteria in a very precise way how to go about doing things like, for example, producing a dairy protein.
And
Was that good? Did you get that?
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah. So you're talking about fake milk.
That's
for
one
example.
way of putting it. It's not a way that I'd necessarily characterise, but
How would you characterise it?
Precision fermentation.
And you could make anything that way. Technically.
A range of things, yeah.
Does that worry you?
Oh, look, I mean, I think Phil said it. The technology is emerging. It's not there yet to be rolled out at scale and to be commercially available at cost to really make a dent in the market. But ultimately, if we look forward another, 30, 40 years, population is going to grow, right? It's inevitable. The global population is growing. I think it's predicted to hit nearly 10 billion by 2050. So, you know, governments, companies, consumers, lobby groups, whatever, they're all thinking about how we're going to feed all these people, all these additional people. So from my perspective, I think there's going to be a role for alternative proteins, precision fermentation, cell-based food, whatever. There's going to be a role there, particularly if it is done in a safe way, so the food that comes out of it is actually safe, at scale, and as cost-effective. But from my perspective, from a red meat industry perspective, I don't think it's an either or, it's an and question for us. And the reason I say that is that the drivers that are driving towards these alternative proteins are around environmental protection, they're around, personal health choices of the food that we consume, and they're around sort of like general environment, societal issues. They're all the same drivers that sit behind our natural farming system. And so we produce a natural product that is, in fact, quite light on the environment compared to other production systems around the world. We are probably one of the lowest carbon emitters in terms of red meat production when compared globally. We've done research, and other independent organisations have done research that tell us that when consumed as part of a balanced diet that includes fruit and vegetable, it is good for you nutritionally, good for your health. So, as the same drivers, we're just there we're providing an alternative option for consumers to make their own choice. And so I'm not particularly worried about it.
No, because you're relying on the story.
Well, I'm also relying
in
on...
other words, don't eat anything without a face.
Well, no, I'm not relying on the story. I'm relying on people making the right choice for themselves.
Yeah.
And if they want to, eat a product which has 16 ingredients versus eat a product which has one ingredient, right. That is their choice.
Yes, that's right.
All government-approved ingredients, though.
Regardless,
I had to explain.
ingredients.
What's your fear for the next 10 years?
It's not so much a fear, but I'm with Sirma and thinking of perhaps on a longer time scale around 2050, we're going to have an extra 2 billion people on the planet. We're going to go from 8 billion to 10 billion, but our protein demand is going to go up by 40%. Why? with only a 20% increase in the population, because in particularly Asia and Africa, there's going to be a further democratisation of wealth, which means as you come out of poverty, the first thing it seems you want to do is eat more protein, and
Real
so
protein.
there's going to be a bigger protein demand. And you think about what Europe's up to with its new Green Deal and its plummeting productivity, and to me it's about food security, and it's, sorry Sirma, but it's about, will New Zealanders be able to afford a steak in 10 years' time?
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think our production levels are going down, and so, in order to make money, companies are looking at moving up that value chain and making it a highly sought-out premium product. Not everyone can afford to eat truffles because they're expensive, but those that do choose to eat it and choose to spend their disposable income can. The same with New Zealand lamb or beef in the future, I would say.
You didn't mention any safety concerns.
No, I don't have any.
You don't have any?
No.
Because you think, the regulations are sufficient?
Oh, I think, some great work by government, but seriously though, in the last 30 years, the way that the food industry has internalised safety and taken and run with it and owned it using its own systems has kind of meant that government's almost become irrelevant in this safety story. We're there to mop up when things go badly wrong, but those are the exceptions rather than the rule, and technology and capability mean that those situations are fewer and further between.
Does it not worry you that, given that productivity has to increase so massively to cater for the burgeoning population, that somewhere along the way standards are going to slip? It's the way of
the market.
It's the way of the market.
No, I don't hold those concerns. I think we've got too many Kiwis who care about what they're doing. In a nutshell. And they're lucky that we're able to label it and market it as being from New Zealand.
Yeah. All right, any further concerns? I'll open it to the floor for questions. Let us go. There's a roving microphone. Stick your hand up if you want to ask a question of anybody on the panel, contentious or otherwise. Let go. Talk about, yes.
I didn't mean racist, I meant xenophobic. Can we edit that? We can edit that, Come.
Sure,
Yeah.
can be
Kia
edited
ora.
out, don't you worry, Glen. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I just wanted to make a statement. I'm not racist, but I care about food miles. So if I could...
Yes, thank you.
Tomatoes from
Why
Italy
didn't
or
I
tomatoes
think of
from
that?
Hawke's Bay.
Food miles.
Food miles.
Food miles are a very poor indicator of the carbon sort of consequence of a production system, right?
Otherwise, nobody would eat anything from New Zealand.
Right. Well, you think about the food miles argument from a New Zealand beef perspective.
It's not a safety issue.
No.
That, but just saying.
But
carry on.
Whereas look at the total carbon cost of producing beef in Europe, and
Correct.
poor old Sirma and her people have got to compete with people who have got their cows in coal-fired barns, 6 months of the year, and they've got to compete because they've put their product on a ship, which would otherwise be empty and going back to Europe.
Yeah, and besides that, I mean, we've done mapping of food miles, and really the production and transportation elements of the total pie in food miles is only about 5%. That is way less than what happens at the end of the life of the product through food waste in terms of carbon emissions. So you've got to keep things in perspective. You can't just say, just because it comes from the other side of the world, it's terrible and it's really un-eco-friendly, because that isn't often the case.
Is there no country that any of you would think twice about eating a product from? Sorry, just to pursue the xenophobia argument for a moment. Anybody?
It depends what the product is.
No, well, all right. But any product from any country.
Well, no.
The world's your oyster.
And we
Not
travel
if
to
it's
those
been
countries
shipped
and we
here.
tend to eat the food there.
Yeah. If it's been shipped here, then it's going to be safe. Yeah. If we go to those countries and we have a bit of a
There
feed,
was
then
something
that's a
all
problem.
about that.
Hepatitis B, hepatitis A and berries.
What did
But
you
then
say?
you find it and then we sort it out. Good on you, Phil.
You can get
What did you say,
hepatitis A
Hepatitis A
and
and
berries from New
berries.
Zealand
Hepatitis A
berries.
and berries. Who sorted that out?
The regulator.
The government.
Yeah.
No, but the people have to
industry.
get sick first, right?
Yeah, no, there's plenty of foods I wouldn't eat from plenty of countries.
Name them.
No, I'm not going to.
I think I've made my point. Have you got the microphone, sir?
No, I haven't, but could you ask...
Stand by.
Just one moment, caller.
I thought that last question you asked quite appropriate to the panel. I just wondered if you asked the audience to put their hands up, whether they would, whether their opinion would be different than the 5 people you had there.
You mean if there any country that they wouldn't eat produce from?
Exactly.
All right.
All right.
Put your hand up if there is a particular country that you would not eat particular produce from. It's quite a lot of people, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's about half the audience,
Is that?
pretty much. No, not because of safety, I'm suggesting. Pull your hand up if you think it's for safety reasons. All right, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, half a dozen. All right. Can I ask you what the safety concerns are, sir? Can you give
Glenda.
Glenda,
There's
can you
a-
give this gentleman
Back
a...
up.
Yes, he's just going to tell me something.
So one of them is the one that Phil just mentioned of frozen
Berry
berries
fruits.
putting into smoothies from various countries where they don't have good hygiene, and I don't trust their
Right.
hygiene situation.
Right.
But which country?
But haven't we had an outbreak of hepatitis A from New Zealand berries?
So historically, China, we've had too many outbreaks from frozen berries from that country for me to trust them at this stage. And I don't think they're all being tested. They may be all being tested by now, I'm not sure, but from that history, I wouldn't be comfortable with them.
And are they labelled as to origin, the berries? Everybody's looking blank. I suspect they're not.
They are.
Made
Are
from,
they?
Made from imported.
No, these berries come from China? All right, that's fine.
Product of China, product of Chile, product of Philippines.
Very good, as long as
Product of
that's
New
the
Zealand.
The latest outbreak went from China, but
Where were they from?
they were from was it Serbia?
Serbia.
Serbia.
Yeah.
Add Serbia to your list, sir. Question over there, yes.
I was going to add to this and say, is it the country of origin that's the problem, or it's us consumers? Thinking about what Glen said before about exposure, dose, is it that we've decided we want to make smoothies out of buckets and buckets of a product that's actually quite safe if you don't eat buckets and buckets and buckets of it? Just a question.
Would anybody like to respond to that ridiculous question? Because that's like, you need another label on it. You say, these are really, really safe, but don't eat too much of them. No, that wouldn't work,
There's
right?
a question at the
Yes, question.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
Yep. Question that no one discussed yet. When, to everyone on the panel, when do you think we will be ready to start discussing production, development and production of genetically modified, improved crop in New Zealand? That would hopefully improve the quality of the product and performance and production and everything.
I could probably have a crack at that one, but
Go on then.
talked a lot.
Go on.
Feeling
Most
self-conscious.
of us are ready now,
I've got a few
what's the
lines on that.
Okay,
answer?
so FSANZ has been assessing and approving genetically modified foods for Australia and New Zealand for the last 20 odd years.
Are you talking about foods or crops?
Foods.
Right.
The product of those crops for sale in Australia and New Zealand, and it's all up until now, up until recently, revolved around this bright line test of novel DNA in the modified food product. New techniques are coming along which completely complicate that because they don't yield food products with novel DNA, so they completely challenge that 20-year-old definition. So we've been handed this conundrum of trying to fix all that, and we're about to go out and consult for the final time on this, and we've kind of foreshadowing that we're going to take a very risk and evidence-based perspective on it, and and essentially rely on this concept of the presence or absence of novel DNA.
Any views on that?
Yeah.
Can I just clarify my question?
If you get the microphone back, you can.
Sorry, just to clarify question, I wasn't talking about the approval, I was talking about the actual development and discussion about development in New Zealand and building this capability in the country.
So,
Yeah,
so
so-
we are developing and genetically engineered foods in New Zealand in the lab. And we have been working in that space, and we won't be the only research organisation for the last 30 years while the government has had a ban on releasing those sorts of products. We are behind the 8 ball because we haven't been able to test them in these countries. And I know, ag research has gone overseas to test some of its products. So I suppose we're all just ready and waiting.
Yeah. So I think perhaps the more straightforward answer to your question is, in terms of time frames, I would suggest that perhaps the 14th of October might have a indication of when we might have an open conversation about GE in New Zealand and the use of GE seeds, plants, food to improve productivity, to actually deliver some benefits for climate change. I'm talking from my sector's perspective, at whatever the use is. But the point is, like Glen said, I think whatever that conversation is and whatever change happens, it has to be done in a very careful and prudent manner to make sure that the science backs the safety of the product and there are no unintended consequences. And at the same time, from a consumer perspective, that we can take consumers along with us on the journey so they don't have an outrage reaction when the government, for example, approves the use of GE seeds in New Zealand.
Do you all share the view that we should get on with having genetically modified foods and crops?
Well, I think we should at least have an adult conversation about it.
Well,
It's been way
an
too
adult
long.
conversation means a change, right? Because
Potentially.
you're suggesting we've been infantile hitherto.
Yeah.
All right, that's the position you hold. And you think we should get on with it?
Yes.
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 Yeah, I think so.
And so do you think that the science that you represent can convince, I suggest to you, quite a large proportion of the public that's worried about it, not entirely on the safety front? There's the issue of, our food and products having a premium because they're GE-free, and there are the politics of it involved.
We can't convince people not to smoke, so I'm pretty sure we can't convince people that GE is safe.
No, I think the people who feel strongly enough to oppose it are in the minority. I think the key is that in having a conversation, we've got to put different information in front of the majority of New Zealanders who will then make up their minds about it. So I don't think the majority of New Zealanders feel strongly about it at all.
Well, not if FSANZ is already approving GE foods.
Have been for 20 years.
And they're in the market and people are buying them.
Yeah, they're labelled.
Yep.
Well, the question may have been answered, so I've changed it a little bit. But I'm writing an essay article for students, basically on general election policies for each party about environmental stuff. And National wants to, their solution to the agricultural problem in particular is to introduce technologies and allow that to get off the ground. Would you say it's fair to say that it's concerning that we're focusing more on the cure than the prevention, or should we be focusing on both, reducing the emissions and introducing technologies, or?
Well, perhaps I can take that. I think in order to reduce emissions, you need tools to reduce those emissions, particularly in the agricultural sector.
I mean, you don't really.
Well,
we
we
just
can
lay off half the cows in the
Right,
country.
okay, so that's fine.
But I mean, I think
And
you've
then
ignored that option.
Well, no, I haven't ignored that option. If we lay off half the cows in the country or half the sheep or whatever, the $40 billion worth of export revenue that the agricultural centre
No, I'm not saying.
No.
You
But
may
this
have
is-
very good
but this
reasons
is-
for
but
ruling
this-
out that option, but
But
nevertheless
this
it is
is
an option.
what the option is,
It's not
right?
much of an option.
So, bankrupt New Zealand, and so we're nice and green, fantastic. Or invest in technologies and tools to help farmers do what they are committed to doing, and that is to reduce their emissions with the use of technology and tools. But those technologies and tools do not currently exist at scale, and certainly not for the extensive pastoral system that we run in New Zealand. So until that R&D catches up, we are in a bit of a bind. Yes, we can convert all the farmland into pine trees. Good luck eating that, guys.
I like what you did there, though, because that broadens out the question of, can science make food safe? Quite right. Because if food contributes to climate change, it can't be safe, can it? Excellent question. Thank you. Anybody else want to contribute to the answer? Or do you think that we said it all?
Oh, I think you need a bit of a balance. You do have to think carefully about our production systems. Our production systems in New Zealand, we should diversify, we should change. We don't want to, I don't think we should stay in the way we have, but the production systems have been changing every
Forever.
year on year for decades. So maybe we've got to the tipping point and we have to change back, but we need something to change to.
But have they been changing? I mean, when you say change, doesn't it mean change away from primary products like milk and meat?
And to change the way we do those primary products. But there's a whole lot of cropping, there's a whole lot of horticulture in New Zealand. So we don't only do milk and meat. So I think that we just need to think about those, think about what the emissions, what the environmental impact of those crops are, work out what the best is for New Zealand, particularly in climate change, because, that's going to change with or without us wanting it to.
Question there.
Hello. Thank you for the amazing discussions over here. I might not have agreed with everything, but it was all very interesting and so good to just disagree in a place like this over here.
What could you possibly disagree with? Don't go there.
So a question I have here is about global equity. Because we are a very rich country, and the reason why this country is rich may lie on the fact that the Western countries used to run colonies, right? And so everyone here is probably in the top 10% of people in the world. And so what are we doing now in New Zealand to bring these places which are now slowly developing up to the standards that we have now about food not only being safe, but food being there to actually eat?
Who would like to take that question? How are we spreading our knowledge to the world?
So we are engaging in international aid programs where we help some other countries who need to produce their foods in a safe way. And so it's not just the production and the yields, but it's also the safety. Plant and Food, and I imagine a whole range of other research providers are doing that. So that's really sharing the knowledge, but it's allowing those countries to develop their systems safely themselves. So it's pretty much sending a few people over at building production systems, introducing new ways of doing things. Yeah.
Thank you. Question over there.
I must say I groaned a bit with the whole country of origin thing, because food is a chain. It's not for nothing called the food chain. There's a producer, there's retailers, there's consumers, and it's the weakest link that determines where it goes wrong. So I wonder whether the panel is willing to indicate what they think is the weakest link in many of these food chains. And it's not I don't think it's necessarily the country of origin. Could be, though.
Sounds like an interesting and subtle question.
Yeah.
What's the answer?
I'll put them on the spot.
Look, I think in a lot of cases the weakest link is possibly the consumer. I mean, certainly if you're talking about microbiological food safety, food that's cooked to death is extremely safe. But
Doesn't sound very tasty, though.
The consumer often has a a rudimentary understanding of a lot of those food safety principles. So I would say that's the weakest link, in my opinion.
Jocelyn?
I suppose the start and the end of the chain. We need to have a really robust environment where we can grow our foods, where our foods are resilient to all the stresses. And then, yes, at the end, where the consumers are eating things that perhaps they haven't been well stored and they haven't been really hygienic in it.
If you look at the horse meat scandal in Ireland, it was the processes and the supply chain and origin, and when companies are getting ingredients from many different sources and then putting them together and then sending them out, and you sort of lose track of where they come from. Hopefully we've learned from that, but historically that was a very weak point.
Did you not like that horse meat?
Oh, no.
Glen?
I won't be drawn on the weaknesses or otherwise of supply chains at a country level. I feel that's xenophobic. Kim? Far too simplistic to be meaningful.
I do not know whether you have a view on this, Sirma.
I do have a view on that. And I think very much like Jocelyn, it is the producer and the consumer that are probably the two weak links working together. And I'm just going to share an example with beef into the US. Of course, they've got regulations that respond to the prevalence of STX in US beef production systems, which are intensive, grain-fed, paddock-based feedlots. That's it. Which does give rise to a little bit more bacteria than our free-range way of producing. So the regulations have set parameters around that, but the reason why the regulations have set parameters around that is because the US consumer prefers to have their hamburger almost raw. Now, we know that if you cook hamburger meat, the STEC bacteria are killed off by heat. And so because they cannot manage their production systems and their consumer behaviour, they're imposing these very high regulatory burdens on the rest of the world that wants to export into the United States. We don't have the same situation in New Zealand, but we have to meet their requirements because of the way their consumers interact with product in the US. So that's
right. Don't go to the United States.
Oh, when you do,
and
when you do, and they ask you how would you like your burger cooked, say well done. They might look at you funny, but you will be safe.
And I say well done to the panel. Thank you all. Professor Phil Bremer, Dr. Peter Cressey, Dr. Jocelyn Eason, Glen, Neal and Sirma Karapeeva. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming.